Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Watergate Break-in 50 years later. This is our two-day online conference to mark the 50th anniversary of Watergate. My name is Shane O'Sullivan, so along with Melissa Graves, I'm one of the conference organizers. And we have a very interesting panel to start off the conference today, beginning with Adam Henig, the biographer of security guard Frank Wills, who was the person who raised the alarm about the burglars and I guess is the best starting point for this story today. So in this panel, we're going to hear from Adam. We're also going to hear from Douglas Caddy, who at 3:30 in the morning on June 17, 1972, was alerted to represent the Watergate 7 after the burglars were arrested. And also we'll hear from Dan Schultz, who then took over as attorney for the Miami burglars in January 1973 during the burglars trial. So we're going to start with Adam's presentation. Presentations will be 20 minutes each, and we'll hear the three presentations, and then we'll bring the panel together for questions at the end of the session. And so you'll see from the Q&A feature that you'll be able to pop your question in the Q&A in advance of that discussion, and then we can filter the questions to the panel as they're ready to take your questions. So we're going to start off with Adam. I think Adam has a presentation he's going to share with us. So over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Shane. Let me just pull this up. All right. Well, thank you for having me. And it is an honor to kick off the conference. And I don't think there's a better way to do so than to set the scene for the night of the break-in. It was June 16th, 1972, a typical summer evening in Washington, D.C., warm and sticky. As most residents were coming home from a day's work, Frank Wills was getting ready to start his. Crawling out of bed, Frank, a 24-year-old night watchman, was scheduled for his usual graveyard shift, midnight to 8 a.m. at the Watergate office building. For the past year, the lanky South Carolinian lived on the third floor of a boarding house less than a mile away from the White House. Frank's one-room apartment had a worn carpet, a bed barely long enough to sleep in, a small color television, and plastic daisies as the centerpiece on a table near the window. He shared a bathroom down the hallway with 8 other tenants. His weekly rent was $14. Able to sleep for only 5 hours, he passed the remaining time before his next shift playing with his cat, watching television, assembling model airplanes, and listening to a police scanner on a shortwave radio. For dinner, Frank rode the bus across town to the southern dining room. Still far more comfortable in the backwoods of South Carolina than in a big city, he ate by himself at this down-home restaurant, popular among Blacks who migrated from the South. Treating himself to the closest thing he had to a home-cooked meal, Frank ordered steak with rice and gravy and peach pie. The tab, $1.75. Afterward, he took the bus to Georgetown and wandered the streets window shopping, something he did often while waiting for his shift to begin. Frank was a loner. He lived by himself, ate by himself, spent his leisure time by himself. Even his job as a security guard involved minimal social interaction. Nor did he have any interest in what was happening around the world. Maybe it was for the best. Current events in recent weeks were anything but uplifting. The war in Vietnam saw no end in sight. Anti-war protesters throughout the nation continued to rage on America's streets. Commercial airlines were subjected to a rash of hijackings. And on May 15th, presidential candidate and segregationist George Wallace suffered an assassination attempt. When Frank returned to his room, it was time to get ready for work. He got dressed in his company-issued uniform, blue button-down shirt, blue slacks, and blue jacket, which included a pocket for his can of mace. Upon his arrival in Washington from Detroit a year earlier, Frank was hired by General Security Services. Given his experience as a department store security guard in Motor City, he joined the Security Force Division. Yet despite the steady employment and his promotion to the rank of corporal, Frank felt he wasn't going anywhere with his current job. On his 20-minute walk to work, the young watchman contemplated getting a better job and making some real money. For the previous 6 weeks, Frank had been assigned to protect the Watergate office building, an 11-story office tower located inside the Watergate complex. The office building's central location enabled building management to lease space to government agencies such as the Federal Reserve, as well as political organizations such as the Democratic National Committee, otherwise known as the DNC. Frank's daily duties comprised of the following: check every door, hallway, parking garage, and potential entry point of the building to ensure that it was locked and secure. If he observed any suspicious activities, he was required to contact his supervisor or, if needed, the police. Never armed with a gun, Frank had few ways to protect himself against an intruder. That evening, he arrived 15 minutes early to his midnight shift. The guard he was relieving told him he would be on his own. Leroy Brown, who was supposed to work alongside Frank that evening, had left his shift early because he was not feeling well. Frank signed in on the employee log and called his employer's answering service to report that he was on duty. And here's the actual log where he signed in. Normally, activity at an office building like this one wound down by the dinner hour. Lately, though, the building had had a steady flow of young, energetic workers who were arriving at and leaving from the 6th floor DNC offices. With less than 5 months until Election Day, the DNC was in full swing, its staff not allowing a single minute to be wasted. The phones constantly rang, typewriters banged and clacked, enthusiastic workers conversed, lots of hyperactivity everywhere, one intern recalled. It was all in preparation for the nomination of South Dakota Senator George McGovern at the Democratic National Convention in Miami that was scheduled to take place in 3 weeks. Recently, guards have reported that party workers often labored into the morning hours, making final preparations. But on that night, the Watergate was eerily silent. 20 minutes into his shift, beginning in the building's basement, Frank set out for his first patrol. Before he reached the underground garage, sorry, hold on one sec here. Oh, I missed the slide. All right, before he reached the underground garage, there were 3 doors that needed to be checked. He checked the first door, it's fine. He checked the second door, it was unlocked. Caught by surprise, he saw a piece of tape that was affixed to the latch. He had seen this before. To save time when going back and forth with heavy equipment, building janitors would occasionally cover a door latch to avoid having to stop and pull out a key when re-entering the building. Even office workers, including those from the DNC, would use this time-saving method. When Wills removed the tape, he noticed that the latch was full of cotton and paper. That wasn't normal. Unfazed, he pulled the material out of the latch and moved on to the final door of the 2nd floor. It too was unlocked, taped and stuffed with cotton and paper. He took the contents out of the latch and secured the door. Now the 2nd floor was clear. He walked down a flight of stairs to check the basement's 3rd floor. As was the case with the previous floor, the first door was secure, but the next 2 doors were not. One had tape and paper inside the latch, while the other simply had not been locked. Something wasn't right. If one door was taped, that would not have been unusual. But 4 doors were unsecured, 3 of which had its latch openings packed with cotton and paper. Highly unusual. Frank headed back to his post in the main lobby and updated the security log. B2, which stands for basement 2nd level, stuffed with paper, both doors. Also, one door on B3 level was open, the other stuffed with paper. Concerned about what he observed, Frank phoned his boss, who was off duty, asleep at his home. Awakened by the call, the supervisor assumed the situation was not as dire as Frank presented it to be. He instructed him to continue to check all the doors on the remaining floor as he normally would and report back. It was likely a fluke. As Frank continued his patrol, a 21-year-old DNC intern entered the main lobby from the stairwell. Bruce Givner was an incoming senior at UCLA and was excited about his summer job. In preparation for the upcoming Miami convention, he was one of many interns tasked with calling and coordinating the political movers and shakers throughout the country. A self-described errand boy, he would hand deliver confidential documents to high-level party officials. His college professor had told him it would be an experience of a lifetime. Of course, Bruce had no clue how true those words would prove to be. He was the last worker to leave the DNC offices that evening. While his fellow interns and supervisor had called it quits at 9 p.m., Bruce had remained to take advantage of the free long-distance phone service to call friends from his Ohio back home of Lorraine. An hour later, he needed to relieve himself. That was a problem. Since the office was closed, if he went to the men's room in the lobby, the office door would lock behind him. Thinking that he may have to leave early, Bruce had another idea, and it did not involve a piece of tape. I remembered the small balcony outside and a flower-filled planter lodged against its front railing, he recalled. Bruce did his deed, and while he was zipping up, he looked at the plants he ruined and he apologized. He actually said, sorry. Later, he described it as the most noteworthy pee break in American political history, since it allowed him to remain at the DNC headquarters for 2 more hours, forestalling entry of the burglars who were in the garage awaiting the signal to enter the building. Shortly after midnight, Bruce had wrapped up his calls. He was famished. He turned off the lights in the office and headed for the stairwell. When Frank saw Bruce, he asked him to sign out in the visitor's log. Nah, you don't need that. I've been here all day. Since I didn't sign in when I got here, I don't think I need to sign out. Frank didn't press the matter, perhaps seeing no reason to pursue it. After some small talk, Bruce asked Frank if he'd care to join him across the street at the Howard Johnson Motor Lodge and Restaurant, where he was going to place a takeout order. Known for its slogan, "Someone you know, wherever you go," it's featured a quaint 24-hour coffee shop. Though Frank was only 30 minutes into his shift, his concern with the unlocked doors packed with paper and cotton conveniently fell by the wayside. The night watchman took his first break of the evening, turning off the lights in the building's main lobby and walking across the street with Bruce. Although they were close in age, worked at the same facility, and were both new to the Watergate, these 2 young men had very little in common. Bruce was on his way to a successful legal career in sunny Southern California, while Frank, who didn't even finish high school, was working blue-collar jobs. Normally, their paths would never have crossed, but on June 17th, they did. Both men ordered the same meal, a cheeseburger, a milkshake, and French fries. Waiting for their order, they engaged in small talk. Once the food was ready, Bruce was about to take off to his cousin's house when he said to Frank, "See you soon." Frank went back to the building. The 2 men would never see each other again. While Frank had been away, his supervisor had called and left a message for him to complete his rounds and then return the call. Frank chose to sit down at the guard's desk and enjoy his meal, putting his rounds and the call to his boss on hold. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, nearly an hour after he stepped away to buy food, Frank resumed his duties. Instead of checking the upstairs offices as his supervisor requested, Frank went to the basement. He took the elevator to where he'd originally begun his shift and once again checked the door. It was at that moment that Frank knew he was not alone in the building. The tape had been reapplied. With a can of mace, and if need be, his bare fists as his only form of protection, Frank was not adequately equipped or trained to confront an intruder. Was there more than one? Were they armed? What was their target? With no clear idea how to proceed, Frank returned to the main lobby, where he encountered Walter Helms, a Federal Reserve Board guard in charge of protecting the agency's 8th floor suite. Frank updated him about the situation. Walter told Frank to call the police. Fearful of being punished, or worse, losing his job for not following up with his boss sooner, he tried to circumvent the situation by contacting the guard he had replaced from the previous shift. Maybe there was a logical explanation, but the guard, who was now at home, said that no locks were taped during his watch. Now Frank knew he was in trouble. Having no choice, he called his supervisor. His boss ordered him to call the police. At approximately 1:47 in the morning, Frank updated the security log. Call police. Found tape on door. In that moment, Frank Wills's life changed forever, and so would the nation's.
Thanks very much, Adam. That's a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. So Adam is going to take your questions a bit later on. So Adam, maybe if you want to just either stop your video or go back to the backstage area, and you'll join us with the rest of the panel later on. Thanks very much. Okay, our next speaker is Douglas Caddy. So he was the initial attorney for the 7 Watergate burglars. He's a graduate of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and New York University School of Law. He's the author of 6 books, including Watergate Exposed, How the President of the United States and the Watergate Burglars Were Set Up, and Being Their Eyewitness to History. And his first book, The $100 Million Payoff, was publicly praised by President Gerald Ford. So if I could ask Douglas Caddy to join me now in the main room, and then he'll begin to deliver his presentation. Here we go. Okay. So Doug, if you'd just like to start your video and unmute yourself.
Here we are. Can you
Great,
hear
you
me?
can take it over, Doug. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, my presentation today is that Gordon Liddy is the key to understanding Watergate. The Watergate scandal did not start with the arrest of the burglars there on June 17th inside the Democratic National Committee. It started in January of 1972 inside the U.S. Department of Justice, inside the office of Attorney General John Mitchell. And there was a meeting there, a meeting of the Attorney General, who was also the campaign manager for Richard Nixon, in addition to being Attorney General, and Gordon Liddy and John Dean. John Dean was the White House counsel, and he'd actually recommended Gordon Liddy, along with Haldeman, to be the person to ferret out intelligence on the opposition being the Democratic candidates for president and the Democratic Party. So Liddy was there to present his proposed plan. And he had it on graphs there, and he started talking, and his plan included kidnapping people, included wiretapping people, included setting up a prostitution ring to entrap people, a whole list of unsavory activities. And Attorney General Mitchell sort of puffed on his pipe and listened to this. And at the end, he said, well, Gordon, that is not exactly what I had in mind, not exactly what I had in mind. I think you should go back and develop something more realistic and much shorter in content. And John Dean was greatly relieved by this because he was outraged and very disturbed that discussion of criminal activity had taken place inside the office of the Attorney General. But let's stop for a moment and examine who Gordon Liddy is. Gordon Liddy was a lawyer who advocated these criminal activities that he did would be disbarred. He was a former prosecutor. A prosecutor would prosecute people for doing these things that he said he wanted to do. He was a former FBI agent. An FBI agent would have arrested an individual who proposed to do that Gordon Liddy wanted to do. And so Gordon Liddy was actually, he says in his book, he believes that the end justifies the means. That's his attitude, that's his philosophy. The end justifies the means. So let's examine Attorney General Mitchell. I mean, how can the Attorney General of the United States sit there and hear a discussion of a criminal activity taking place right inside his office and not actually toss the fellow out or do something, ask him to leave? But he didn't. And this shows how dysfunctional the White House was under Nixon. The whole White House was dysfunctional from top to bottom, and allowed a person like Gordon Liddy to emerge and do what he did ultimately. So Gordon Liddy and John Dean left the room, left the office there. And the next thing, I'm going to do this chronologically, by the way. The next thing happened in April. In April, at that time, I was working for a law firm in Washington. It was a labor law firm. All it did was labor law. And there were three partners, and one of the partners called me in, John Kilcullen. He called me in. His client was the National Right to Work Committee. And he said, Doug, I just got a call from George Webster. He's the chairman of the Lawyers Committee for the Re-election of the President, and he's looking for a volunteer lawyer. And you are hereby volunteered. You're going to work part-time for the Lawyers Committee. And so what you should do now is call George Webster and get your assignment. So I called George Webster. He was the chairman of the Lawyers Committee. And he said, report to John Dean in the White House. I thought, well, that's starting at the top. I mean, John Dean was the White House counsel. And John Dean's diary shows that on April 25th, George Webster and I met with him inside John Dean's office in the White House. And at that time, I got my assignments. They were all ordinary legal research assignments, nothing unusual in a campaign. I got these from John Dean. And I was doing these part-time. And then I got a call from George Webster again early in May of 1972. And he said, Doug, I now want you to also work for Gordon Liddy. He said, Gordon Liddy was the legal counsel to the Finance Committee for the re-election of the president. That was a separate committee that was in charge of receiving money and reporting, making proper reports on what had been received and so forth. It was separate and apart from the committee for the re-election of the president, which was the campaign committee. So I reported to Gordon Liddy. He was in a separate office building, and I recognized him because I remember seeing him in January. In January of 1972, I was invited to by a friend who had just recently got engaged. He wanted me to meet his fiancee, and he worked in the White House. And he asked me to join them for lunch. And there's a called the White House Mess, MESS, where the employees of the White House have their meals. So I went there, and just as I arrived, Gordon Liddy arrived. I did not know who he was, but the host introduced us. And so we proceeded to have our meals. It was there to celebrate the engagement of this lovely couple, but all Gordon Liddy wanted to talk about was this movie he had just seen called Triumph of the Will. Triumph of the Will. It was a Nazi propaganda movie. It was made in 1934. It was to celebrate the Nazi Party Congress there, which 700,000 Nazis attended. 700,000 Nazis raised their arms in a salute, Nazi salute to Hitler when he spoke. It was a pure propaganda film, but it was acclaimed because the photography was extraordinary. It's still acclaimed as being, forget about the content, just for the techniques and so forth. It was a wonderful film, but and can be praised for that only for that reason. But Gordon Liddy just talked endlessly about lunch there. Nobody else could get a word in about this wonderful film, about Hitler, about the Nazi movement, and so forth. And I thought, well, this is really strange. Here's this individual. Here's this individual who's legal counsel. Turned out later on he was legal counsel to the Finance Committee. But at that time, I knew he was working in the White House. Actually, at the time I met him, he was working as a White House plumber on the plumber's test, trying to ferret out leaks of classified documents that were being leaked to publications. But anyway, so I recognize Gordon, and when I went there in May and I got my orders from him to what he wanted me to do, which is essentially more legal research, just like I've been doing for John Dean. And it was about this time, by the way, that Gordon Liddy had a meeting that really changed how the whole Watergate scandal turned out. He was frustrated because what he wanted to do was it's sort of been sidetracked. So he tried to figure out how he can get it quick started again. So he approached his friend Howard Hunt and said, you know Chuck Colson, you both went to Brown University. Chuck Colson was actually the sponsor of Howard Hunt inside the White House. And he said, could you arrange a meeting with Chuck Colson and for me? And so the meeting was arranged, and Liddy sold his program to Colson, and Colson picked up the phone and called Jim Magruder and said, let's get this program on the way. Sounds like a good thing to me. He made 2 calls to Jim Magruder about this, by the way. And at that point, Gordon Liddy became the decisive guy in decision-making, and especially in decision-making of going into the Democratic National Committee. And so he actually was in some ways above Jim Magruder, who was an assistant to the president. Of course, Chuck Colson was a special counsel to the president. He was one of the 3 people closest. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Colson were the 3 people closest to the president. And so when Colson spoke, everybody picked up what he was talking about and followed through and so forth. Well, the next thing that occurred in May was Hunter called and said he wanted me to have lunch with him and Gordon. And he said there's a club there in the Georgetown section of Washington, which is for the intelligence community only, for the NSA, for the FBI, for the CIA, you know. And so it's a private club for intelligence officers of the intelligence community. And so we met there for lunch, and as soon as we sat down, the 3 of us, Gordon Liddy started talking about, once again, dominating the conversation like he had done back in the White House mess in January. And he talked about his expectation to get a high position in the White House in the Nixon administration when Nixon was reelected. He wanted to be a high position in the Treasury Department. He had worked at one time in the Treasury Department. And so we talked endlessly about his expectation and so forth and so on and so forth. And at a certain point, a man entered the room and was seated at a nearby table. At that point, Howard Hunt leaned back in his chair and said, there's a SOB Cord Meyer, okay? Cord Meyer. Turned out Cord Meyer was a very high CIA official. His former wife was the mistress to John Kennedy. She was killed a year after Kennedy was killed because she knew too much. And there was a big struggle over her diary after she was killed between Ben Bradley of the Washington Post and James Angleton of the CIA. I think in the end, Angleton got her diary, which contained all sorts of vital information. But in any case, at that point, Liddy excused himself to go to the restroom, and Howard turned to me and said, have you made your decision about joining the CIA? And what he was talking about, previously in April, he had asked me to meet with him and Lawrence Houston, who was the legal counsel to the CIA. I didn't know what the purpose of the meeting was, but it turned out they were interested in whether I wanted to join the CIA. And I said I would have to think about it. But in the back of my mind, I thought, well, I'm a gay person. I'm a closeted gay person. I'm not sure I could pass the vetting process to join the CIA. So I just said, I'll think about it and get back to you. But at that luncheon there, Liddy asked me, had I made my decision? I said, no, I haven't made my decision yet. I'm still thinking about it. And then he said, out of the blue, he just said, Daniel Ellsberg is not a traitor. He's not a traitor. He's misguided and misinformed. Well, all I knew was from what I read in the newspaper that Daniel Ellsberg had released the Pentagon Papers. I didn't even know anything more than that. But as it turned out, after Watergate broke, we learned that Hunt and Liddy and their team went to Beverly Hills and broke into the psychiatrist's office, the psychiatrist to Ellsberg, trying to get the psychiatrist's file on Ellsberg, which they were unsuccessful in finding. But for some reason, Howard just blurted that out to me at that lunch, and I remember that to this day. Okay, at that point, Liddy returned to the table and resumed talking again about his high expectation of getting a position in the administration. It was all about him, basically. And so I'm doing it chronologically. So the next thing that occurred about a week later, Liddy called me into his office there at the Finance Committee and said that He had just received a large donation to the campaign from a donor in Florida. And he asked if the donor had asked for a recommendation of a lawyer in Washington who could handle a real estate problem he had in the District of Columbia. And Liddy said he volunteered my name and gave my phone number to that fellow. And he said, the fellow may call you. And if he does, I would appreciate it if you respond to him. And because he is a donor, we would certainly want to treat our donors fairly. And so actually the fellow did call the next day. He explained the problem to me. And I said, well, Memorial Day weekend is coming up. I would like to come down and visit you in Florida if it's agreeable to you over Memorial Day weekend. And he said, that'd be great. So I flew down to Florida and visited the donor and his wife. They live in Delray Beach and got all the information. I wrote up a report that I later delivered to John Kilcullen back in the when I returned to the law firm back in Washington. But then I spent 2 days on the beach in Fort Lauderdale, just enjoying myself. And but later on, after Watergate broke, I learned that while I was in Florida on May 28th was when the burglars first went into the Democratic National Committee, and they put a microphone in there in one of the phones there to pick up telephone conversation, but it didn't quite work. It didn't work adequately, so they had to go in again. That's why they were going in on June 17th. That's why they were going in on June 17th to repair and do other things that had to be done inside the Democratic National Committee. And so what happened next actually was on June 17th itself. I was at home, sound asleep at 3:05 a.m. I've testified so many times about this in different proceedings. At 3:05 a.m. on Saturday, June 17th, I got a phone call from Howard Hunt. Howard Hunt said, I'm in my office at the White House. An important matter has come up. I need to see you. Can I come and see you? I said, come ahead. I lived less than a mile from the White House, and as it turned out, less than a mile from Watergate. I called downstairs and alerted the clerk that a fellow guest was coming, so to admit him when he came to the entrance there, which the clerk did, and Howard arrived at 3:35 a.m. And he didn't brief me what had happened at Watergate, which was at the five of their burglar team, he called them, had been arrested. McCord and the 4 Cuban Americans had been arrested. Alfred Baldwin was across the street and Howard Johnson, and he saw the arrest taking place. He was on the same level as the Democratic National Committee across the street in the Watergate office building. He could see the arrest taking place. So he called Hunt and Liddy, who was in the Watergate Hotel, and told him about that. And they immediately fled from the Washington Hotel. So they were not arrested. It was only the 5 McCord and the 4 Cuban Americans. And he said, we need to get these people on bail as quickly as possible. And I said, well, I said, Howard, as you know, because you're a client of the firm. He had come to the firm 3 times previously before he went on the staff of the White House on personal legal matters, because I had known Howard previously. And a partner of the law firm, Robert Scott, joined us each time we had a consultation. So I said, Howard, you know, we're a labor law firm, and we never do criminal law. I'll have to call a partner of the law firm to find out how to proceed. Because I was just a staff attorney, you might say, in the law firm, regular attorney. And so I called Robert Scott. He was the only partner in town. One was in Florida and the other one was in Italy with his wife. And actually, I thought it was great, Robert Scott, because he knows Howard Hunt. So I explained to Robert Scott briefly on the phone, and Robert Scott said, they must have been set up. They must have been set up. He said, sit tight. I'll get you a criminal defense attorney that will work with you in representing these individuals. And I'm going to call my nephew. So sit tight, I'll get back to you. So he called back about 25 minutes later and said, well, I retained Joseph Rafferty. He's a criminal defense attorney. And you're to meet him at 8 a.m. He gave it a location because the arraignment of those individuals would take place that morning. So I would only get about an hour's sleep basically before I would have to get going on this matter. And then he said, I also talked with my nephew. And so and he hung up. So I explained this to Howard, and he said, well, we also want you to represent the 5 arrested individuals. I want you to represent me and the 5 arrested individuals, and I'm going to call Gordon Liddy. So I used my my telephone there in my apartment to call Gordon Liddy, wherever Gordon Liddy was, and explained what Robert Scott had worked out for us. And then he handed the phone to me, and Gordon Liddy said, well, I want to retain you to represent me in this matter, in this case also, and to represent the 5 arrested individuals. And I agreed to do so. So at that point, I found myself arresting 7 individuals, the 5 arrested individuals, and Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy. And so Howard Hunt at that point departed, went home. And so I met with Rafferty, the criminal defense attorney, and we found the defendants inside a police precinct. And then we went to the arraignment. The arraignment sort of became exciting at a certain point because James McCord announced that he had worked for the CIA, and everybody's eyes and ears perked up at that, including mine. And so the bottom line, bail was not granted to those individuals, the 5 arrested individuals at that arraignment. And I had an uneasy feeling about that. I felt like we were expected to arrive there, that Rafferty and I were expected to arrive there. And actually, I think it turned out that Robert Scott, who was actually a Democrat and a labor union lawyer, I think he may have phoned ahead and paved the way for our expected arrival without our knowing about it. Be that as it may, so the bail was not granted, so the defendants went back to the DC jail, and so we tried to get them out on bail subsequently. But the next thing that happened actually in the case was the following Friday. This is Friday after the case broke in Watergate at the Democratic National Committee. Gordon Liddy called me and said, I want to meet with you tomorrow in your law firm on Saturday. And I said, sure, come ahead. So this is June 24th. So he came to the law firm, and once he entered, he said, here, he held a dollar bill. He said, here's the retainer. Here's the retainer. Here's my legal fee. We now have a attorney-client relationship. And I said to Howard Hunt, I said to Gordon Liddy, I said, Gordon, who dreamed this thing up? Whose idea was this? This is mind-boggling. It boggles the mind. This whole thing boggles the mind. And he wrote back like he said, it was mine. I did this. It was my idea, he said. And he did so with pride. He was very, very proudful about the whole. There was no remorse at all. No remorse at all. He was actually exuberant. And then he looked out the window behind me. My office faced Connecticut Avenue. I was on the 7th floor. Our office building was close to the White House. And he said, this is the biggest criminal case of the century. And he said that with pride. He was exuberant. He was actually on an emotional high. He was actually, it's unbelievable. There's no remorse at all in his demeanor. No apology for what had happened. And at that point, I realized, I was looking at him, I said, there's something going on in this man's mind that only he is privy to, okay? I didn't know what it was, but we figured it out later on. At that point, he said, well, I have to leave. Is there a way of getting out of the building without going out the front? And I said, there is a rear entrance to the freight. You can use that. So the last time I saw Gordon Liddy that day, and for a while, was when he got on the elevator and waved at me. The next time I saw him, it was actually in December at the Watergate trial. And at the Watergate trial, at the beginning of it, Hunt pleaded guilty, and the 4 Cuban Americans followed him. Hunt pleaded guilty because his wife had been killed in a mysterious accident in Chicago the previous month. I had gone to the funeral. It was a very, very sad affair. And Howard was left with 4 children to raise as a result of that. And so his attorney, William Bittman, his new attorney, persuaded him to plead guilty. Bittman had his own reason for doing that, a personal reason for doing that, but he actually wanted Hunt to plead guilty. Hunt did do so. So the trial was only about Gordon Liddy and James McCord. And at a certain point, I testified. I was an involuntary witness for the prosecution and a voluntary witness for the defendants. My whole role is very complicated, but we can't get into it in this brief session that we have today. But it turned out I was a witness at the trial, okay? And Earl Silbert, who was a prosecutor, who will be speaking later on in this conference here, he asked me a question while I was on the witness stand. He said, about this $1 bill that you got from Gordon Liddy there, is your usual custom to accept $1 as a fee or as a retainer? And I said, well, no. I said, there was no one else in the law firm that Saturday. There was no one I can consult with, so I accepted it. I mean, you don't insult or upset a client by just saying, no, I'm not going to take your dollar bill, obviously. And so anyway, but for some reason, Earl Silver wanted that on the record, and so that's one thing I do remember from my testimony on the record before at the Watergate trial. Later on, the jury, the judge said the jury would now go to the jury room and discuss reaching a verdict. So Gordon Liddy and I went across the street and had a brief lunch and came back. Just as we got back, it was announced the jury had reached a verdict. And so the jury came in and the verdict was read, and Gordon Liddy and James McCord were found guilty of all counts, and the marshal led them away. And so that's how that ended there. But it's important now to go back and to go back now to June 17th. It's important to go back to the just before the burglars went into the Watergate office building to burglarize it. As your previous speaker discussed, there were all these tapes that had been put on and removed inside the office building, and James McCord put those on there, and he came back and reported that some had been removed. This is about 12:30 in a.m. as I understand it, so Liddy later testified at a deposition in 1996. He said they held a powwow. By they mean the team. They mean by it was Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt and McCord and the 4 Cuban Americans. Should they go ahead and go on in, or should they call the whole thing off? That was the issue. The Cuban Americans said, well, go with that, whatever is decided. Whatever is decided. Well, Howard Hunt was against this going in from the very beginning. From the very beginning, even before he said, this is weeks before, he said, we should never go into the Democratic National Committee a second time. It's too dangerous. So he said, I'm against going back in. McCord was wishy-washy, but he said, well, we might as well, I'm here, we might as well do it. And Gordon Liddy said, well, I'm the operational manager. I'm making the decision. We're going to go back in. So the team went back in, and they got arrested, as we know. They got arrested, and so we have to ask, why did Gordon Liddy make this decision? We really don't know what is in the mind of anyone at any one time. We don't know what is in my mind. I don't know what is your mind, but we do know from the actions and by the utterances that a person made before and after an event, you can get an idea of what was in his mind. And so remember that luncheon at that private club for the intelligence committee where Liddy talked about his expectation of getting a high position in the administration. That was going through his mind. In other words, in my opinion, I don't know, nobody knows exactly what was going on in his mind, but based on that and on his visit to me afterwards inside in the law office on that Saturday, I believe that he said, if I don't go forward and with this, if I don't, I will never get that position in the high position in the Treasury Department. If I go back and say we called the whole thing off, that would be the end of my ever getting a high position. So he gambled. He gambled on the presidency. He gambled on the people of the United States. He gambled on history. He went ahead and ordered the team to go in. He gambled on his own ambition. What was best for him? What was best for him? And they got caught. And by the way, right across the street, there was a trap waiting for them. Right across the street was Carl Schaffler, who was a military intelligence agent assigned to the Washington D.C. police, and he was a police detective, and he knew it 2 weeks ahead of time of the break-in, and he was waiting for a call that the burglars were inside the building so that he could rush in and arrest them, which he did. He was the arresting officer along with his colleague of the Watergate burglars. So the bottom line of Watergate is it was Gordon Liddy's personal ambition that that led to in Watergate that led to the bringing down of the president of the United States. Now, getting to the end here, I'm going to hold up the headline of the. This is the headline of the New York Times of April 1, 2021, last year. G. Gordon Liddy, Watergate scandals, remorseless ringleader dies at 90. Okay, this is a very interesting article, very long article, and I'm just going to read this one paragraph because it really sums up, I think, what Liddy was all about. Decades after Watergate entered the lexicon, Mr. Liddy was still an enigma in the cast of characters that fell from grace with the 37th president. To some, a patriot who went silently to prison, refusing to betray his comrades. To others, a zealot who cashed in on a bogus celebrity to become an author and syndicated talk show host. And actually, he had a movie made about. This is his book, Will. Okay, it's interesting. Will, like in Triumph of the Will, he named his book about the movie about Hitler, about the movie that Hitler had made about that Hitler had made in 1934. It was Will. It was his will. It was his will that brought about Watergate. Without Gordon Liddy, there would never have been a Watergate. That's the bottom line. It was his decision, no one else's decision. It was his decision at that moment. He could say, no, we're not going to go in, but he said, yes, we're going to go in. That changed history. And so I've given you a summary of what, but there's a much longer story here. And if you want to read my article, my complete article, you go to Education Forum /Watergate, type that into Google, and it will take you to my article on Gordon Liddy, which is much more detailed. And so that's the bottom line. The bottom line is that Gordon Liddy is the key to understanding what happened in Watergate. I want to thank the moderators for inviting me to participate in the program today.
Thanks very much, Douglas. That was a really fascinating presentation. It's an honor to have you with us today. Thanks very much. So if you'd like to, stop your video or go backstage, and then you can join the other panelists a little bit later. And yeah, so now we're going to have a discussion with an attorney who took over the representation of the Miami burglars, the Cuban Americans, during the trial, which you alluded to. So I'm just going to ask Dan Schultz to join us on screen, and then we'll have a discussion around his experience with the Miami-based burglars. Dan, thanks a lot for joining us. So just to introduce you to Daniel Schultz, so he's a graduate of Ripon College and Northwestern University Law School. He was a criminal and civil trial attorney with the federal government, Department of Justice, and in private practice from 1966 to 2013, and recognized in the Best Lawyers of America. And his publications include Will Jury Nullification Save Oliver North in the Legal Times, 1987. And his precedent-setting cases included the establishment of the good faith reliance on apparent authority defense during his representation of the Cuban Americans in the Watergate case. Welcome, Daniel. So yeah, I mean, I think as we discussed beforehand, it would be really interesting just to get the starting point of how you came to represent the Cuban Americans in the Watergate case, and some problems they'd had with their attorney just in the early days of the trial. If you could just set that up for us.
Sure. Thank you, Shane, for including me on the panel. I appreciate it. I became involved, sort of Doug Caddy, who just spoke, was the beginning attorneys for the Cuban Americans. I was the last attorney for the Cuban Americans. I became involved in late January, I believe it was. They had pled guilty in the middle of January. Maria Elena Moffett, who was Bernie Barker's daughter, came to me asking that I come visit the four, meet them and represent them. What she said to me was she had been recommended, I had been recommended to her both by Earl Silbert, who she had talked with, and by Bill Bittman, who she had talked with about getting someone to represent them. So I went down to the lockup to meet with them, and decided that I would undertake that responsibility.
And so what were the issues that they were having with Henry Rotblat, who was their attorney during the early days of the trial? What was the dilemma in terms of the guilty pleas and so on?
Yeah, well, they believed that they were to remain silent and not talk about anything they knew. And they were following Hunt's lead, who in the middle of January, at the start of the trial, had pled guilty, told Judge Sirica he wanted to plead guilty, and had worked out a deal, or his attorney did, worked out a deal with Earl Silbert to plead guilty to, I think, 3 of the 6 counts. Well, Judge Sirica wouldn't let him, and said that he wouldn't accept that deal. Hunt then came back the next day and said he would plead guilty all 6 counts. And so he did. The Cuban Americans saw that as a signal to them that they should plead guilty, and wanted to do that. Their attorney at the time, Henry Rothblatt, was an attorney out of New York. I didn't know him. His reputation was one of a kind of a flamboyant, publicity sort of seeking attorney, liking to be in the spotlight. He had refused to allow them to plead guilty. He publicly took the position that he was out of principle. He thought they should not do it, and he would not go along with that idea. Maria Elena Moffat told me that that was not completely the case, that he wasn't really opposed to their pleading guilty, but he wanted to have control and assurances that the money that would be provided to their families while they were in jail would happen, and the way it would happen would be he would have control of it. Well, that wasn't going to happen, and so the end result was that the 4 Cuban Americans formally discharged him. Judge Sirica appointed a court-appointed attorney to represent him so they could plead guilty, and that's what they did. Again, this whole episode is one of following the guidance of Howard Hunt, who recruited them and became involved as their superior officer, really, in all of the operations that they did.
Yeah, I think there was an element as well where they felt if Hunt pleads guilty, well, we've kind of got to plead guilty as well in terms of the evidence stacked against us, you know.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah,
and it was a way that they would not then have to. They saw it as what Howard had done was because of the continued desire to remain silent and not talk about it and not reveal information, and that's what they thought they were supposed to do. That was what their conclusion was, and I think that was the signal that Howard Hunt had intended to give them. This is the way to go.
And so from your experience of discussing this with the Miami burglars, who did they think they were working for? What was the purpose of the operation? And how did that change over time as they understood more about it?
It gets complicated, and maybe a longer answer than is needed, but it goes back to the Bay of Pigs. It goes back to Fidel Castro taking over in 1960, I think it was, in Cuba, and the planning for the overthrow of Castro by our government. They all 4 of my clients, Cuban Americans, Frank Sturgis, Rolando Martinez, Eugenio Gonzalez, and Bernie Barker were involved in the Bay of Pigs operation. They weren't in the brigade, which was formed by our government of expatriates from Cuba to form a military group, an army, which was trained in Guatemala. They were too old for that at the time. They were recruiting and wanting to have younger men from Cuba, Cuban Americans in the brigade. But they were instrumental in recruitment and in the Cuban community to facilitate this. And what got them involved was Howard Hunt. He was known as Eduardo in the community. He was the CIA representative or organizer, one of the more instrumental people in the CIA as far as the Bay of Pigs operation was concerned. Well, he had worked closely with Bernie Barker, and all three of the other three knew him well because of the Bay of Pigs. He showed up down in Miami on the 10th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs. Bay of Pigs was April 17 of 1961. So April 17 of 1971, he goes down to Miami and he leaves a note for Bernie Barker saying, "I'm back in town, come meet me, Eduardo," using the name that he had used as his cover name for the CIA and the Bay of Pigs. Well, Bernie Barker was ecstatic. Everyone in the community, the Cuban community, had been waiting for the United States to begin again another effort to overthrow Castro. I mean, that was the hope of the whole Cuban community down in Miami. And this looked like something might be afoot. Well, they had a nice meeting, and Howard let Bernie Barker know that he was operational again. He was in the White House, and things were going to start happening. And that was the beginning then. Well, of course, Bernie told Rolando and the others that Eduardo was back and something may be about to happen. That followed then further meetings with Howard, where he told Bernie and then the others, but that he was the operation that he was involved in at the White House was a national security organization that was separate and apart and above the CIA and the FBI, and was involved in national security matters. Bernie believed it. They all believed it. Bernie actually, he got correspondence from Howard Hunt on White House stationery. He actually visited Howard Hunt in Washington, D.C. and went to the White House and met him at his offices, room 16, the plumber's operation. What they were told then was that they had operations that had to do with national security. The first one was Ellsberg, concerning Daniel Ellsberg, and it was an operation that involved getting intelligence on Ellsberg as a national security risk, a quote traitor, end quote, and the break-in of Dr. Fielding's office out in California, who was Ellsberg's psychiatrist. That was the first operation. They knew who Daniel Ellsberg was. He was, considered by many to be a traitor, but he was definitely national security sort of focus. And it went from there. But they, at first, when people first hear about what they did, they're a little bit incredulous that they could believe breaking into the Watergate, breaking into Dr. Fielding's office, that somehow could be legitimate. But this goes back to, conducting a war, participating in invading a country without a war being declared, without any paperwork showing that this was legitimate. And it involves working for the CIA, Barker had worked for the CIA. He was a spy in Cuba for them, and had to be exfiltrated out when his cover was blown. Martinez Rolando was involved both in the Bay of Pigs, and he would continue to be operational for the CIA afterwards. He never saw any paper that said what he was doing was approved or legitimate or legal. And he continued after the Bay of Pigs, working first in what they call mongoose. Mongoose was, the government didn't stop going after Castro with the Bay of Pigs. President Kennedy created and approved another operation to take its place called Mongoose, is what the code name was for it. And it involved a variety of things, all seemingly quite illegal, including plans for assassination of Castro, causing disruption within the country, and a wide variety of operations. Well, Martinez was running a marina. It was a front for the CIA. He was a boat operator. The boat he ran was a CIA boat, all undercover, of course, and with a front on it. But what he did was, over a span of years, did boat operations, infiltrating people into Cuba, exfiltrating people out of Cuba. Over 300 missions he performed, and well after the public, supposedly the Mongoose program had, quote, shut down. Well, they hadn't stopped, because Martinez kept doing this all the way into the late 60s. And at the time he was involved in the Watergate, he was still an employee, and he was being paid by the CIA. They had stopped the boat operations and had discharged all the other members, the crew that were involved, except for him. They put him on retainer. And he continued to report to his case officer. He continued to be an asset of the CIA and on their payroll, all through the Watergate. There was every reason from their standpoint not to question Howard Hunt. He had the legitimate credentials. He had the visibility. He had the White House office. He had the background with the CIA. And for all they knew, he was still a CIA asset. But they believed what they were doing was for the betterment of the country. They believed they were involved in investigations into foreign influences and national security. There's a lot of questions, I think, still about, why exactly were they going into the DNC, for example, but what they saw and what they knew and what they believed anyway was there was information that the foreign money was coming into the DNC and the Democratic Party. And what they were looking for was documentation of that fact, leads as far as where funds were coming from, and at the same time having bugs placed by McCord on the phones to pick up information that had to do, supposedly it had to do with tracing and tracking the foreign money that was supposedly coming into the Democratic Party in connection with the presidential election. And that to them, that made this legitimate, and that's why they did it. Everyone who's looked at the details that I know have concluded that they believed them, that they believe this is what they were told, this is what they did and why they did it, and that they were snookered. They were talked into doing this, and they were recruited intentionally with the idea of placing in their heads the idea that all this was approved national security and approved at the highest level of the government. And that's what the probation officer who did the pre-sentence report for them, for Judge Sirica, believed it. The special prosecutor's office, when they were tried the second trial during that had to do with Dr. Fielding's break-in, acknowledged in court that they did not challenge what they were claiming. They accepted it as true. Judge Gazelle believed it. He was the judge in the second trial, and that's reflected in the fact that he gave them a suspended sentence as a result of the conviction in the Fielding break-in case.
And I wonder in terms of McCord, Timothy Naftali through the Nixon Library Oral History Project, I've seen the recorded interview he did with Martinez, who was very suspicious of McCord's motivation, and that McCord, some of the elementary mistakes that McCord made on the night. I think some of the Cuban Americans thought there may be more to those than meets the eye in terms of
right.
agenda. What did they say to you about that at the time? Or, what do they feel about Hunt and McCord, and had they been used by them potentially?
They had serious questions about what was going on. And it started with the Fielding break-in, which was the first operation back in 1971, September, I think it was 1971. They went in to get information on Ellsberg. They got into the office, they went through Dr. Fielding's files. Everything was there. He had files on all his clients, all his patients, but there was not a folder for Daniel Ellsberg. And so they left that office without accomplishing anything. And they came back out and rejoined Hunt and Liddy out in California, who were waiting for them, and told them that they had failed, that there was nothing there on Daniel Ellsberg. Well, Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt got a bottle of champagne, opened a bottle of champagne and toasted them and acted like this was a successful mission. And they didn't understand that, because it wasn't. They also didn't Martinez in particular thought this was a very amateurish kind of operation. Poorly planned, very little, background, very little preparation, like he would have expected from a covert operation that had to do with the CIA or intelligence operations, that kind of thing, which he had been used to. It just wasn't. And that was true then for Watergate. Watergate, again, was handled in a very kind of sloppy way, including the first entry in May. And they came away believing, or not being happy with how things were being handled. And had some serious questions about McCord and why McCord on the second entry was using tape for the door locks. They had Gonzalez there. Gonzalez was a locksmith. That's why he was there. He was the key man there to open doors. But McCord went ahead and put these tapes on and then put them back on. It didn't make a lot of sense to the Cuban Americans. Frank Sturgis was muscle. He was there for that purpose. Gonzalez was there for purposes of gaining access, and they didn't use them. So there were questions, and I think that the full explanation of what was going on, I don't think maybe has ever been known. Martinez, for example, was given a key, and it was he had it when he was arrested in the Watergate. That never became a big issue during the Watergate case, and it wasn't for me. I knew he had a key. I never asked him, well, what was the key for? What was he supposed to do with it? Nobody did. It wasn't important at the time. Later, it seems, I believe, that he got the key from McCord. And it was a key and that McCord had gotten from Baldwin. And Baldwin had made the duplicate key when he had been in the Democratic National Committee headquarters a few days before. and it was a key to his secretary's desk. Very strange. He never got to use it because the police came and arrested them before, a very short time after they had entered. I don't think Martinez ever told anyone what that key was for. I think he died. He died at the end of last year or the early this year. Was the last of the Watergate 4 that passed. I think he went to his grave with that information and had not revealed it to anybody. But it does raise a question, I think, as to what in fact was going on and why would he have a key to a secretary's desk and what documents would he have been looking for? I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Doesn't add up.
No, I mean, I remember I asked him about it and he said, I don't remember and I don't want to remember. And his whole approach was whatever hasn't come out so far, it's not going to come out through me. So he still had a certain loyalty to intelligence circles in terms of just keeping silent on anything that hadn't surfaced and become public to date. You know? So
that was him. He was a fascinating guy. They all were their own way. Martinez was so good looking, handsome, and distinguished looking that when I would go with them before they were incarcerated, but we would go to court together, the four of them and myself, and we'd be walking into court. A lot of people thought Martinez was the attorney, and I was one of the Watergate burglars. I mean, he really was an impressive guy. He was very smart, very savvy, very smooth operator. And boy, he could keep secrets. He was remarkable. He believed, as did Bernie Barker believed, that I was a CIA asset when I started representing them, and for quite a while after that, I was there to provide cover for them and help them, but that I was placed there I was a CIA asset. So when I would ask him questions about what had happened and what they did for the CIA and things like that, they would look at me and say, if you were supposed to know that, you'd know it. And if you don't know it, you're not supposed to know it, and I can't answer your question. I went around and around like that, and then I'd have to go. I did get access to CIA information, records, and all that, and they're very trying circumstances, but I did. So I did find out about Barker's operations and association with the CIA, Martinez's, and Frank Sturgis as well. And I'd go back to him, and now I knew something. So I'd say, okay, what I want to do is I want to talk about X, and it would be the name of the operation. And I want to find out more about, these things. Well, then they would tell me because I knew, but up until then, nothing. And so I had to keep going back and forth and get more information and talk with them. It was a circus, is what it was. And Bernie Barker was a lovely guy. He was when he left the CIA, when they severed after he'd been exfiltrated from Cuba and stayed on through the Bay of Pigs, and that when he was ceased to be operational, he told a CIA case officer who was terminating him, he said, if you ever need me again at drop ahead, just call. I'll be right there for you. I mean, he was that kind of loyal person and eager. He was like a puppy dog, is what the CIA called him. And Frank was muscle. He was a character in himself. He was a lieutenant for Castro when Castro overthrew Batista. Yeah, Batista. It was one of his first lieutenants. And when Castro turned communist, showed that he was going to align with Russia and it was going to be a communist state, Frank left. And he became an active anti-Castro revolutionary in Miami, identified very closely with the Cuban community. And he had flights over Cuba, sponsored by and paid for by the CIA, even though he was not considered to be an employee, was not on retainer being paid. He was considered to be an asset. So I had 3 out of the 4 that had very direct involvement, and Gonzalez he was such a sweet guy, so quiet. Mr. Schultz always, that type of thing. Frank would call me Danielle, but Gonzalez would Mr. Schultz, and he would, he was just like nothing. He went along with whatever everybody else was doing. But such a nice guy. And after it was all over and they were out of jail, he went back to the life he had before as a locksmith and resumed his life. So he was a nice guy. They all four were very interesting people, and it's part of the reason why I stayed involved and represented them and felt good about it. I mean, I represented them for 4 years, from 73, from January 73 to 1977, through the appeal from the Watergate case, where they wouldn't let them withdraw their guilty pleas, to the Fielding case that was tried before Judge Gazelle, and then the civil suit that we filed against Creep. I filed for them, asking for damages because they had been fraudulently induced to participate in these break-ins, believing that they were national security matters. To the settlement of that suit, which was in 1977, and the request for pardon that we put in for all four of them, which was denied at the time. And Martinez went back and worked for the CIA after the Watergate. Much as they disavowed, any relationship with him for the longest time, and reluctantly agreed that he had been had been associated with them and on payroll. After the Watergate was over, he ended up working for the CIA again. He was approached by Cuban intelligence in Miami to recruit him to be a spy and to report to Castro in Cuba on what activities that were going on in the Cuban community, and also becoming an advocate for Castro and trying to stir up, favorable interest and all that. He reported that initial contact to the CIA through his case officer. They encouraged him to let it play out. He was contacted again. They flew him, they meaning the Castro's intelligence agency, flew him to Mexico to meet with a high official. He was also taken and flown into Cuba and met with high officials in the Castro government. He didn't meet Castro, but he came close. And what he was doing was he was working as a double agent, and pretending to be agreeing to work with Castro people in Cuba while he was working for the CIA. The guy was remarkable. And it was actually because of that continued effort afterwards that Martinez ended up being pardoned. He was pardoned by Reagan. And in large part because of his both prior and continued involvement and assistance to the CIA in whatever way he could do it. And as it turns out, historically, there were only two people who got pardoned. One was Nixon by Ford, and the other was Martinez, Rolando, by Reagan, which I think is kind of an interesting footnote to the whole mess.
It's an amazing
And
story.
I consider myself a footnote to a footnote,
No, it's been fascinating kind of getting in touch with you recently and talking about these things. I think we've gone a little bit over our slot, so I'm keen to bring in the other panelists just so we can have a group discussion to finish the panel and also take any questions. So Douglas and Adam, thanks for your patience if you'd like to join us. And then we can also take any questions from the audience. So Jeff Morley has a question for Doug. So Jeff says, Doug, and I'm looking forward to reading Jeff's book, which has just been published on Watergate and the CIA, Nixon, Helms relationship. Doug, thanks for your presentation. I don't know if Doug can hear us yet. Right, well, maybe I'll wait to ask the question until Doug is with us. While we're waiting for that, Adam, I just wonder if you could fill us in a little bit about what happened to Frank Wills after Watergate, because your book was fascinating on that, and Yeah, and I guess a certain cynicism that crept in, that, you know, he was kind of used and abused by the media a little bit, but then forgotten.
Yeah, yeah, it's unfortunate. Look, Frank, as I mentioned, didn't graduate high school. He didn't have the wherewithal to navigate the political landscape, the celebrity circuit. He partnered with an agent who was a bit shady and took advantage of him. And unfortunately, Frank did not come out as well as many of the other Watergate figures who went on to earn millions and became household names. Frank died in poverty. He contracted AIDS, which hadn't been documented prior. And it's just a very sad, tragic life. Frank obviously, you know, wasn't intending to be involved in any sort of political scandal, and he just wasn't prepared for it. And unfortunately, I think in the end, he regretted it because it really became a cloud over his life.
I think I should say something here just to clarify. The Cuban Americans didn't end up being millionaires. They went back to their life. Martinez went back and began working again for the CIA. Bernie Barker resumed his, I think it was real estate, and Martinez also had a car dealership that he did. Frank, I'm not quite sure how he made ends meet, but none of them ended up with any kind of, you know, financial reward for what had happened. And they didn't receive any, and also I should say, they didn't receive any money, any of the support money that supposedly was going to go to the families. Howard Hunt used them. He would go to the Creep people and he would send to his other people in the White House, and he would say, my guys are getting very anxious. My guys are getting close to talking there. They need support, you know, as well as I do. And he got tons of money. He got a couple $100,000, I think, at one point. And another time, equal amount of money. Well, he kept it. He didn't pass it on to Martinez and Barker and Sturgis and Gonzalez. And in fact, they were all up in Danbury, Connecticut, at the minimum security prison there, serving time for their Watergate time. That is Hunt and the 4 Cuban Americans. And the story broke about Hunt while they were there, about Hunt receiving, you know, $300,000 from Creep in the papers and the news. They didn't see it in the morning, but they all had breakfast together and they would have lunch together. And they were now 4 of them sitting around having lunch. And Howard Hunt had not shown up in the morning, and he came down to join them for lunch. And he walked over to the table where they were and sat down, and Martinez looked at him, and he has this very heavy accent. And he says, "Howard, what did you do with all your morning?" And Howard thought he said money, not morning. And he turned white. He said, "Oh, I didn't get that much. It wasn't that much. I had to pay my attorney." So they were abused in a lot of ways by Howard Hunt and by what happened to him.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a common thread across some of these characters. You can see the economic disparities in terms of how Hunt and his lifestyle and his nanny from Argentina and all the rest of it, you know, accounted for the bulk of the money that was given to the burglars, and the Miami burglars just got tidbits, really. And yeah, I mean, obviously Frank Wills, I think he got a $2 a week raise or something like that, Adam.
Oh no, that's what he was making an hour.
Oh, that's what he's working in, yeah. But he got a small raise, didn't he? I think
it was 15 cents. Yeah.
Something else that Doug had said when he did his presentation about Liddy being, you know, responsible, a number of things he said, but one of them that I thought struck me, he was a character. I mean, I saw him frequently in court, and never personally, but he would look at you, and I mean, and you would get uncomfortable. And then he'd smile, and it'd make it even worse. I was down at court one time, the first time that my young associate, who was the only one working with me on the Watergate case, Melinda Murray, the first time she was in court with me and met Liddy, and Liddy stared at her. And I mean, he just kept staring at her because she was a new person, I guess, and he hadn't seen her before. We came away from, we went back to our office after that. We were in the cab and she turned to me, she said, you know, when he stared at me, he gave me chills. That man is dangerous. And that's the kind of image he portrayed. He was quite a character.
Yeah, wow. We have a couple of questions. So Doug, are you with us? Can you hear us? Maybe if you want
I
to
can
turn
hear
on-
you. For some reason, I'm not, I can hear you, but I can't get the video working.
Okay, well, no problem, as long as you can hear us. So we have a couple of questions for you from the Q&A. First from Jefferson Morley, thanks to you for your presentation. You've spoken elsewhere about a conversation you had with Hunt about Cuban government records relating to JFK's assassination. Can you recount that story and what you make of what Hunt told you?
Well, I did have Hunt was going to go to prison in 1975. And he called me before he went to prison. I had only seen him 3 times. That was the 3rd time. I saw him the night that he came to my apartment. I saw him at the funeral of his wife. And then he called me and asked me to join him that time. For legal reasons, it's so complicated that I can't really get into it. It's in my autobiography, being there, however, because Judge Ricca held me in contempt of court and so forth and so on. That we just had no contact. We had no contact until then. And so I did meet with Howard Hunt at it was the Yinqing Palace there in 1975, Yinqing Palace there in Washington, D.C. And we did have a meal there. And I was able to ask him some questions that I said, why do you go into Watergate? I never knew why they went into Watergate, you know. And he sort of beat around the bush basically, and finally I kept pushing him, and finally he said, "Well, we went in there to get government documents, Cuban government documents on the assassination of Kennedy." It all goes back to Richard Nixon being running for president in 1960, and he wanted Howard Hughes to set up assassination of Castro, and that could help him get elected to the presidency. So Howard Hughes gave this to Mayhew. That's very complicated, and it got underway. But Nixon was not elected president. Kennedy was, okay. But this had all got started under Nixon, and so there was a question there apparently there was a worry there of linking him back to getting Howard Hughes involved in trying to assassinate Castro that could haunt him in the campaign for re-election in 1972.
Okay. We have another question for you, Doug, here from Leslie Ragsdale. So says it's been a fascinating panel. Thank you so much. Please give more details on the fact that a police officer had knowledge of the break-in and was waiting for it to happen. So I think you mentioned Carl Schaffler earlier in your presentation, Douglas.
Yes, well, I would recommend for starters that everybody read Secret Agenda by Jim Hogan. Jim Hogan's, I wish I had it on video. I have it in my hand right here. This was published in 1984. It's as relevant today as it was then. And he gets into the Carl Schaffler question very much and talks about Carl Schaffler being a block away, you know. And so Carl Schaffler had his own informant, Robert Merritt, and I wrote a book subsequently with Robert Merritt about this whole subject called Watergate Exposed, how the President of the United States and the Watergate burglars were set up. That was published in 2009. And so Schaffler had his own reasons for bringing down Nixon. He wanted to bring down Nixon. He was military intelligence. Don't forget there was a military intelligence operation going on in the White House. Remember Yeoman Radford, they caught him with he copied 5,000 documents from Henry Kissinger's briefcases and so forth, classified documents, took these things back to the Pentagon, to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And so there's a White House, there was a military operation going on and Carl Schopper he came from the Pentagon and was assigned to the Washington DC police. He was a military intelligence agent. There was also a CIA operation going on inside the White House, and Howard Hunt was a CIA operation. Howard Hunt would send reports to CIA Director Helms. So Nixon actually was surrounded by people who had their own agendas. And the military was very upset with Nixon because he was opening the doors to China. And the CIA was very upset with Nixon for the Houston Plan. Under the Houston Plan, the role of the CIA would be cut back quite a bit. There would be an independent organization. That's the whole. Actually, Watergate is all about the Houston Plan. It's a complicated subject, but Watergate, in my opinion, is all about the Houston Plan. And Nixon's setting up these alternative organizations to compete with the existing bureaucracies, you might say.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes, and we'll have a panel later on today where we talk about the Ray Locker. We'll talk about the Maura Radford affair, and also we'll talk about James McCord's potential links to some elements of those kind of former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who were very worried about Nixon and Kissinger's kind of détente with China and the Soviet Union. So stay tuned for that. I think final question from Jefferson Morley for Dan. Did you have any contact with Manuel Artime, Hunt's friend who started a defense fund for the burglars?
Yes, I did. I had the pleasure of meeting him. I had a nickname for him. He's a very prominent person, very impressive guy, and was the lead on the committee that had been formed to raise funds, which did raise funds and helped me with some money for the fees and time I was doing. Those are the only funds I got at the time. But he was a funny guy. I called him Dracula because the only time, except for when I went down to Miami and I saw, he would call me at midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning in order to talk about what was going on and things like that. And I mean, I was working my butt off and I'd have to take, these calls would come in and I'd be in the, trying to sleep. And I turned to my wife and I said, this man just must not, do anything during the day and he works all night. He's Dracula. But he was a very good guy and a very important person of the Cuban community. So it was a privilege to meet him and I was grateful for his help.
Great, thanks, Dan. We've just one final question for Doug from Tim Reardon. So would you address documents at the DNC regarding a list of politicians who were involved in scandalous sexual liaisons? Was that part of the motivation for the break-in? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Good guy.
Tim Reardon asked that question, is that correct? Tim Reardon asked that question.
Tim Reardon asked that question.
Yes, I know him. Apparently, yes, there was a prostitution ring being operated at the nearby at an apartment complex, and the DNC maintained a book that people could use to contact the prostitution ring. That's a whole big subject in itself.
It's a whole other panel, I think. But yeah, I mean, there's this goes back to the bugging and the phone calls, and secretaries are using the phone, and there's the whole theory about
right.
Some of the liaisons that were being set up through that. But I think it would take another panel to kind of uncover that potentially. Yeah, but go to the Silent Coup is the book to go for, and if you're interested in delving more into that. I think we better wrap up because we're just 6 minutes over now, and we've a presentation from Timothy Naftali coming up in 24 minutes time, and so it'd be good to get a stretch and get a break for everybody. So I'd just like to thank a wonderful panel. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope you have too in the audience. So Adam, Dan, and Douglas, thank you very much for joining us. Really enjoyed the presentation. It's being recorded, so you'll be able to catch it up if you missed any of it. And thanks again for your presence today. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks to the audience for joining us. And next up in the conference, Timothy Naftali in 24 minutes time. So we'll see you in that one. Thank you.